Welcome, everyone. I'm Nanci Bell. I'm honored so many of you have joined me today. What I'm going to share with you is personal to me, and I hope personal and informative to you. The focus will be on the cause, diagnosis, and instruction related to language and literacy skills. Let's go. In 1986, Pat Lindamood and I established Lindamood-Bell learning processes. Our vision was to help each individual reach his or her potential, no matter the age and no matter the previous diagnosis, nor the extent of the struggle that they had experienced with language and learning skills. We dreamed big. The journey began in a clinical environment, and that's Pat Lindamood, one-to-one. We observed, and that's me, with all the hair. To the right, we observed the learning process, asking ourselves why some individuals learned easily and others did not. Our questions were extensive, as many of you probably have. Ours were the same. Why could some children easily learn to read from an early age, yet others could not? Why did some children read far below their potential, unable to catch up despite years of special education, a host of reading programs, often years of summer school and or private tutoring? Why could some read text easily? This is a high school boy, yet not easily understand what they read. I'm sure you've seen those students. Why could some individuals answer complex questions about content that they'd read, that had been read to them, yet they were not able to sound out words nor memorize simple sight words? Why could they do one but not the other? Why did some have to read content over and over and attempt to understand it? And why did some seem confused or distracted when reading or listening to language? And then as ASD became something more and more people were discussing, and we were getting more and more referrals for these students, we had a lot of questions. Why were many children labeled autistic, easily able to read words and recall facts, but not comprehend what they read nor follow conversation? For us, kindergarten through 12th grade and then on into college and adults, we saw a range of students that came to us, many with previous diagnoses, many of them with frustration and extensive frustration in previous programs that they'd worked with. So our questions were simple. Why was an individual in 11th grade reading at a first grade level after years of experience? What was happening with him that was different than, say, an individual in 5th grade who could decode words years above his age level but comprehend significantly below? So we had lots of questions. And our questions were related to cause, diagnosis, and whether there were instructional solutions that we could provide for these students. Here's what we learned. First, I want to talk to you about the cause. We learned what was not the primary cause. The primary cause was not related to socioeconomic factors. It wasn't ethnicity. It wasn't IQ. It wasn't bad teachers. It wasn't a lack of trying. And last, it wasn't because the students, young and old, didn't care. But what we finally learned was the primary cause was related to how the brain can process information. And so what I put on the screen is the brain can only process sensory information. The primary cause is at the sensory level. Individuals experiencing weakness in language and literacy skills also experience weakness in sensory input. And most important, we called the sensory input sensory cognitive functions. There's 3 sensory cognitive functions I want to talk to you about today. This one is very familiar to you, I'm sure, phoneme awareness, and if I'm referring to it later on in my talk, I'll put PA down for that. The phoneme awareness is the ability to perceive the identity, number, and sequence of sounds within words. The second one is maybe less familiar to you, and it is related to the whole conversation with you today, and that is about imagery. Symbol imagery is the ability to create mental imagery for sounds, and what's important here, and letters within words, not just sounds, but letters within words. Concept imagery is the ability to create an imaged gestalt, whole, for oral and written language. Let's just look a little bit more closely at these. Phoneme awareness, that ability to perceive the identity, number, and order of sounds within words, was actually one of Pat Lindamood's primary contributions to the field of education. She created a test along with her husband Charles called a LAC test, where they used little colored blocks to have the students show that they could perceive sounds within words. I'm going to give you an example of that. For example, if I say I, the student would show one block. If I said Z, the student would add a different colored block at the beginning. If I said ziz, the student would add the same colored block at the end as was at the beginning, showing that that sound was repeated. If I change ziz to zuz, can you tell what would change and what block you would have to change? Right, you would have to change the middle block. I bet that the same time you were perceiving those, you were also visualizing some letters in there, and that's what, of course, symbol imagery is. If that says ziz and I want to show zizzed, can you tell what you would do? Right, add a sound, a different block representing a different sound at the end. Now, the problem is that we saw a lot of students that could not do well on that test. And so what we knew early on from Pat's work was that these students had phoneme awareness problems, difficulties. And those phoneme awareness issues related to their ability to sound out words that they had not seen before. Although some of them could do fairly well with memorizing some words, they had really significant issues with word attack. And what we found in developing phoneme awareness for our students was that often we could develop their word attack skills, but they still had difficulty memorizing sight words extensively. And I'm sure you've seen that too. So in walked symbol imagery to our life at Lindamood-Bell. And if we want to think of phoneme awareness or phonemic awareness, we want to now be thinking of symbol imagery as orthographic awareness. And remember, the definition is to perceive sounds and letters within words. So here's what symbol imagery is. I'm going to have you experience some of it with me. If I show you that and then I take it away, can you tell me the second letter that you saw? You should be able to hold that in your memory. And what if I asked you to change the I to an A, and you would be able to tell me that that word said frasp? And that's your symbol imagery skills. So what we learned was that you could have students that had developed their ability to perceive sounds, yet still had not developed their ability to visualize letters and words, and that was had a definite impact on their ability to read connected text and memorize sight words. What we did then was we developed a test for that, and the question that I had in my mind was it related to phoneme awareness, like we had been doing so much of? And if you look at the LAC test on this, just quickly, I'll show you that there's a strong relationship between phoneme awareness and symbol imagery. The next thing was, did symbol imagery actually relate to more than just phoneme awareness? Did it relate to word attack skills, word recognition, spelling, reading rate, reading accuracy, and fluency? And with an N of that 717, what we found was not only did it relate to it, but it also predicted reading. So if you take this independent variable of the symbol imagery test and the LAC test, and these are the CTOP tests, but if you just look at just our two tests. When the SI test and the LAC test were combined to predict student performance in word attack, word rec, spelling, all those across the top, the SI test was the strongest predictor in every case. Let me see if I can erase this and show you that. For example, the total model of testing predicted 0.52 or 52% of the variance, but if you look at the SI test predicted 47% of the 52. And you can look across there and see that the SI test was predictive in every case. And it's especially important if you're looking toward reading fluency and reading accuracy in paragraphs. Now let's look at concept imagery. Remember, that's the ability, again, to visualize, but it's not visualizing the parts such as letters, but it's visualizing the whole, or what I refer to as the gestalt. So that's a different type of imagery. If, for example, I say to you, visualize, or what do you picture for the black stallion running on the racetrack and the jockey falling off? Those words, that language is going to create some mental representations for you. So here's an example of that that's very different than this example. That's symbol imagery, and this is concept imagery. And why I wanted to start off like this is that it's important for you to know that as we evolved at Lindamood-Bell in working with students, and certainly Pat and I started it, but we have had a lot of wonderful people working with us that have become like family over the years. One of the things that we learned is that there are two types of imagery. One's related to parts and one's related to wholes. So make sure we have it. Symbol imagery, concept imagery. Two different types of imagery, and those two different types of imagery they play a different role in processing language. So the next thing that I want to talk to you about is, out of that experience, did that experience match any theory in the field of language processing? So what we learned from experience was that there was the sensory input of imagery underlying language and literacy skills, but did that match any theory out there? And yes, it did. First of all, those sensory cognitive functions underlie language and literacy skills, and processing language is a cognitive act. And because of the relationship there, we wanted to make sure that there maybe was a theory of cognition, and indeed there is a theory of cognition related to imagery and verbal processing. And that theory is called dual coding theory, or DCT. This is Dr. Pavio, and he said, cognition is proportional to the extent that the coding mechanisms of mental imagery and language are integrated. He said performance is mediated by the joint activity of the verbal and the nonverbal systems. So clearly, the nonverbal system is imagery, and that cognition is always an interplay between those two systems. So if you're thinking only that that's about cognition, then it's important to know that Pavio also talked about DCT and language and literacy skills. He suggested that linguistic competency and performance is based on a substrate of imagery. Individuals differ in the extent, the manner, and the efficiency of employment of each of the systems according to their verbal and nonverbal habits and skills. And so what I want to talk to you about today is that we now know that there are individuals that have differences in their ability to create mental representations for letters and create mental representations for concepts. And that brings me to diagnosis. It's at this juncture, I want you to understand that even though you understand that theory, you have to be able to put that theory into practice in order to make a difference for the individuals that you may be working with. And so you have to have accurate diagnosis in order to have accurate instruction. So at Lindamood-Bell, we look at imagery on a language processing spectrum for decoding and for comprehension. And I've, of course, put weak decoding, since we would see students that might have difficulty with decoding, and weak comprehension. And when decoding is significantly impaired, it is often labeled dyslexia. And when comprehension is significantly impaired, it's often labeled hyperlexia or autism. So the spectrum is long from decoding to comprehension. You can have students that have no trouble with one and only have difficulty with the other, or vice versa. So we're going to be talking throughout the rest of this presentation about Buzz and Natalie. And I'm going to be presenting case studies for you. First, let's look at whatever this configuration is in the middle, where I have a Venn diagram. I called that years ago the reading circles. Now we refer to it as the component parts of reading with the underlying sensory cognitive functions. This is showing you a paradigm of reading, and it will show you the sensory cognitive functions for the component parts of reading. So I'm wanting you to understand where would concept imagery fit and where would symbol imagery fit. So in auditory, it would be phonological processing and word attack. In visual, it would be orthographic processing and word recognition. However, one of the things that we learned from the SI testing is that SI, symbol imagery, also underlies phonological awareness or is related to it. And then if we think of reading as more than just word attack and word recognition, but being able to read on the page, it's also then what I call the language circle for contextual reading and vocabulary. All of those are subsets of the greater set of comprehension, because comprehension is the only reason to read. You know that you have seen students that can sound out words or can memorize words, they can read easily, but still not comprehend. And so they're not the greater set, they're the subsets. So the greater set is comprehension. Now, in order to diagnose for where your student might be in these subsets in the greater set, you need to do a learning ability evaluation. And in that learning ability evaluation, you want to note strengths and weaknesses and diagnose what parts are easy, what parts are really easy, what parts are not so easy, in general looking at strengths and weaknesses. And at Lindamood-Bell, I will tell you that we don't believe that you teach to a strength and not worry about a weakness. In fact, it's just the opposite. If we see a student that has weakness in word attack and word recognition, we build those up so that they become a strength. So here's what one of our evaluations looks like. They're all standardized scores or standardized tests, and we look at a standard score, a percentile, an age equivalent, and a grade equivalent on each of the tests that have those. And I'm just going to quickly show you some of the tests that we give. So this is a receptive oral vocabulary test. And this is an expressive oral vocabulary test. And when we're diagnosing, or when a student comes in for approximately a 4-hour test, one of the things that we're trying to understand is if the student is 11 years old, does he have a percentile at the second percentile or the 90th percentile? And is that a strength or is that a weakness for him? How does that compare to everything else? So we look at oral language comprehension. We look at obviously following directions. We look at the Woodcock reading mastery test for how well the individual can sound out words that he or she has never seen before. This is a word recognition test. How well does that individual recognize lists of words? We look at word reading and spelling and math on the wide range achievement test. We look at contextual reading. How well does the student apply their word attack skills and their word recognition skills to paragraph reading? And on the gray oral reading, we can look at reading rate, reading accuracy and fluency and comprehension. We do the phoneme awareness test, we do the SI test, and we do a sound symbol test. We do, for some students that are having specific difficulty with math, we look at what's called a TOMA. We look at more tests for reading comprehension and written language. We can also do a preschool analysis. In general, it's a very comprehensive diagnostic testing battery. And I'm going to show you now Buzz and Natalie. And I want you to know how to think about percentiles. And I'm sure many of you already know this, but I'm going to show it to you for the people who might not. When you look at percentiles, the 50th percentile, 25th, 50th percentile is obviously right in the middle. They usually range from the 1st to the 99th. And this is a stay 9 down and a stay 9 up. This area in here is considered a strength. This area in here is considered a weakness. However, when we are working with students and we see them at the 37th percentile, it's definitely within the normal range, but perhaps not as strong of a skill for them that you want. So let's take a look at Buzz. He is a shy 6th grade boy. He has strength in oral vocabulary and oral language comprehension. This is a real student that I worked with a long time ago, and I've changed some of this, but it's based on a real student. He has struggled to learn to read despite many years of school and many different reading programs. So let's take a look at Buzz's scores and put them in that Venn diagram together. He was, at this time, his chronological age is 12, and he's starting 7th grade. By the end of 6th grade, however, Buzz hated reading and still couldn't read. Let me tell you before we look at these tests that we actually worked with Buzz on phoneme awareness, and we improved his word attack skills, and it changed his life. But the difficulty was that he still hated to read, and I think you'll soon see why. Because what we improved over here in word attack did not necessarily improve his word recognition. So there's Buzz's Peabody, his receptive oral vocabulary. How's that? Good. His word attack skills, look at that, 95th percentile, and that's because of the intervention that we did with him. So if he's at the 95th percentile in word attack, that means he can sound out words that he hasn't seen before, but when he's reading on the page, unless he has a lot of words memorized, then he's going to be slowed down and not reading fluently and maybe perhaps guessing. So his word recognition was definitely not as strong as his word attack. So I would probably fill it in like that. Unfortunately, that's a gap for him. His ability to follow oral directions, how was that? Excellent, right? On the gray oral reading test, putting him in paragraphs, look at this. His reading rate was significantly below his word attack skills. And the reason for that was that he had to sound out way too many words. He couldn't just recognize them. His paragraph reading accuracy was at the 25th percentile. Again, look how far down that is compared to his ability to sound out words. His fluency, which is a combination, by the way, of these two scores, was the 16th percentile. Now, how do you think Buzz's reading comprehension might be? That's the next thing we're going to look at. Given that he can only read those words at the 25th percentile, you would think that it wouldn't be higher than that. But in fact, Buzz had significantly higher, or substantially higher, had a substantially higher score in comprehension than he did the others. And that matches many times what we had seen with our students had been diagnosed as dyslexic, as Buzz was. So let's take a look at Natalie. Remember that Buzz he's our SI student. Natalie is on the comprehension side. Let's take a look at hers and see how different she is from Buzz. Natalie is a quiet, shy 11-year-old in 6th grade. She performs at a high school level in word attack, word recognition. So if I put this up here, our Venn diagram, and we look at word attack, word rec, contextual reading, and here's comprehension. What we now know is that her word attack, her word rec, and her spelling are significantly higher than her grade level. Her oral vocabulary is above the normal range, and her paragraph reading, which would be this one, is at the 91st percentile. Her reading comprehension and ability to follow directions are below her potential, and I'll show you testing in just a moment. By 3rd grade, Natalie's parents were told she wasn't attending and she wasn't completing assignments. So if you think of all those students that we saw in that K-12 pipeline, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, you can see that it began to deteriorate for her. By 5th grade and 3rd grade, her parents were told she wasn't attending. By 5th grade, the same complaints continued, but they had that Natalie wasn't motivated. So this was going the wrong direction. By 6th grade, Natalie began to have stomach pains prior to going to school. And by 6th grade, she thought she wasn't as smart as the other students. So here's her scores. On the Peabody, in great shape. On word attack, how's she doing there? Right, she's good in word attack. See how she is in word recognition, completely filled in. Definitely a strength in those two. How about following oral directions? A gap between her ability to understand the meaning of words and her ability to follow directions. Well, that's a puzzle. Why would that be? In looking at her paragraph reading, her reading rate, unlike Buzz's, was extremely high. Reading accuracy, 95th percentile. Fluency, if you combine those two, 91st percentile. All of this is good, but remember these are only subsets of the greater set of comprehension. So let's see how she was in comprehension. What would you think she would be with all of this strength in vocabulary and reading words accurately and quickly? You would think that it would be good, but it was at the 2nd percentile. So now we know that what had happened to her, and she's actually a girl from the United Kingdom, what happened to her was that she was undiagnosed. She was sitting in that class. At one point, they tried to move Natalie to the front of the room to see if putting her at the front of the room in this private school would help her perform better. And so her weakness at the sensory level was completely missed. And this is what was happening to her. As the language came in, whether it was following directions or whether she was reading it, it was going in one ear. And this is what so many students have said to us. It's like it goes in one ear and out the other. And originally that's what I thought. I thought that it was completely gone. But in fact, it wasn't. It Students like Natalie get parts of what they read and parts of what they hear. And so they tend to get facts, dates, bits and pieces, actually. But that's that's pretty much the extent of what they get. And if that's all you're getting, when, for example, you're listening to me now, if you're only getting bits and pieces, you maybe remember some colored blocks and somebody talking about symbol imagery, you're not going to then grasp the whole of what I'm wanting you to get out of this. Because in order to think critically, you have to have the whole. And we believe passionately, by the way, that imagery is the sensory information that prevents language from going in one ear and out the other. There honestly isn't any other way that you can hold that language in your head. If the brain can only process information through the senses, you can't smell it and taste it. You've got to be able to image it in order to keep it there. And that certainly matches our experience, and it matches what Pavio said. But more important, how does it impact your higher order thinking skills, your ability to get the main idea, draw a conclusion, predict and extend and evaluate? If this girl only gets parts, if that's primarily what she's processing, then in conversation she's going to be somewhat lost. In reading, she's going to have to read things over and over, because you cannot get the main idea if you've only gotten parts. And obviously you can see you can't draw a conclusion, make an inference. Although I'm sure that there are many times that you've seen people draw the wrong inference, and do what you might think is illogical thinking. I certainly, I've watched that as I watch politicians talk on television. I sometimes say to myself, they need our help. The symptoms of weak concept imagery need to be gone over with you, because unlike Buzz's problem, where he has difficulty reading the words accurately and fast and applying it to context, and that's a relatively easy thing to understand. It's easy to see that somebody has weakness if you see them misspell a word. Like if you see them spell this for equipment, you say, oh, that student must be dyslexic. Or maybe they put a K in there, and then it really looks like the student has trouble reading words. But Natalie's problem is a little bit more difficult to diagnose, and therefore I want to go over what the symptoms are. Obviously, weak reading comprehension, and I think that obviously to you now you get that it's weakness in processing oral language and comprehending oral language. And I think that you probably get that it's also going to be that there would be weakness in critical thinking and logical thinking, abstract thinking, and problem solving, and following directions. But these were relatively new for us when we first started looking at this. The students that we saw that were like this also had difficulty expressing language orally. And in writing, they would write linearly and miss the point. They would either be extremely quiet in expressing themselves orally, or they would be off topic in what they were talking about. They often had trouble grasping humor. They would get slapstick humor, like a pie in the face, but have a lot of difficulty processing language-based humor, which would have a gestalt from which to think. Interpreting social situations, it would be as if they would grasp a part of a social situation and not the whole of it. Obviously, difficulty with cause and effect. They could be brought in for a talking to with a teacher, saying this and that happened on the playground, and because of this or that, you're going to have this or that consequence, and they would have trouble with that. Mental mapping. I worked with a student diagnosed on the spectrum who was in high school and was invariably lost. They could hardly let him walk without them in MAL. And the big one, I think, for ASD is responding to a communicating world. Because if you're having difficulty processing oral language and written language, what are you going to do? You're going to have trouble responding in the world that is language-based. So, as I said to you, we're going to talk about cause and diagnosis. And now we're going to talk about instruction, because the question for Pat Lindamood and myself was, if these individuals have this much difficulty processing sensory information, is there anything that we can do that would develop that sensory information, or what we call sensory cognitive functions? And so our Lindamood-Bell instruction is often for decoding only students who only have that weakness, as Buzz did, or comprehension only students that would only have the weakness, like Natalie. And when we were doing decoding, we do Seeing Stars in the LIPS program. And if it's imagery that we're focusing on, which is largely what we're doing now, it's Seeing Stars. And for comprehension, it's visualizing and verbalizing. And then Talkies is the version of VV that I wrote with Christy Benetti to help those students that had been either young or had been diagnosed on the spectrum with really rather severe language comprehension problems. But I want you to know before we go on that there are students that we do see that can have a need for decoding and comp. Maybe they have a little bit of weakness in decoding and a lot of weakness in comprehension, or vice versa, or sometimes they are challenge students for us where they have weakness in both areas. What I'm going to talk to you about in instruction when I show you some data is just isolating them to decoding only and comprehension only. So the first thing that you're doing is looking at the diagnostic testing, and they're doing that so that you have an appropriate instructional plan. I have taught workshops on comprehension only, visualizing, verbalizing workshops, and after 2 days found out that someone had been using visualizing and verbalizing, which is for comprehension, for 8th grade students that had decoding weakness. And so it is really, and that was of course an inappropriate instructional plan. VV would not help those students. So it's important that the diagnosis be used to establish an appropriate instructional plan. And what we talk about here is that all the instruction has to drive the sensory bus. And that means that the language from this teacher has to ask questions that bring imagery to consciousness. So when you see Nanci saying, what is the second letter you picture in the word soil? That is to develop symbol imagery. When you see her saying, what did those words make you picture? She's developing concept imagery. So here's more specifics on symbol imagery. Now this is a test for you. Which parts of that Venn diagram would symbol imagery apply to? Is it word attack? Yes. Is it word recognition? Yes. Is it paragraph reading? Yes. Would it impact comprehension? Not specifically, only in that if these get developed for the student, then they are very much more likely going to be able to comprehend what they read. So here's the teacher language. What letters do you see when I say the word FIP? And there's Buzz, and he visualizes it, and obviously we start with just sounds, just phonemes and graphemes at the isolated level, and then move to the syllable level. So he pictures it and he says FIP. And I'm developing his, what we now refer to as orthographic memory for decoding, and that's through his symbol imagery. So I hold a card like East, and he pictures it, air writes it, that's him writing in the air, and says EAST. And then I can start to ask him specific questions, and my goal is to bring his symbol imagery to consciousness. What was the second letter you saw? And so he has to hold that in his head and give me the letter back. Take out the S and tell me what the word says. So he pictures it, he takes out the S all mentally and air writes it and then reads it. What letters do you see when I say mash? He doesn't see anything in front of him now. I'm just giving him a language orally. He pictures it and says M-A-S-H. Read the word from memory. I can still see it. Mash. And then you go from single syllables, making your way up to consonant, consonant, vowel, consonant, then to 2 syllables, then to 3 syllables. And I'm just going to give you a quick example of that. The student looks at a card like that, breaks it, and says he's already learned his affixes. And he says, I see my beginning and my ending. And he starts to take it apart. And he says proudly, oh, extremely, I'm doing extremely well. By the way, Buzz gained 5 to 7 years in reading in the time that we worked with him. Not his word attack skills, which stabilized, but his ability to memorize words and read in context. When I first worked with Buzz, and this is just an aside from the slide, he could be shown a sight word like K-N-O-W, and he would go know, and then I would say, no, that word says, or I wouldn't say no, I would say the word says, no, it doesn't play fair, it's like I know you. And he, when I would put it on a card, we would go over that card. The next day he would still not be able to remember the word no. K-N-O-W is no. And if he read K-N-O-W in a paragraph, he would have trouble recognizing it every time. So his weakness in symbol imagery was severe. So concept imagery. Now we know that concept imagery is related to comprehension. And now my language has to stimulate the whole. And first we do that with just a word, and then we move to sentences, and then we move to sentence by sentence. And I'll show you just a little bit of that. At the sentence by sentence level, I'm going to ask this of my student. What do those words make you picture? The little black and white striped archerfish lives in a stream. And then I actually say to the student, what do those words make you picture? And this is Natalie, and she says, I picture a black and white striped fish. Believe me, it's not all that easy. Many times the student at the word level, when you say, what do you picture for clown? I've had college students say to me, just a regular old clown. And in fact, they really don't have much imaged in their concept for the clown. They're just saying the word back. And so at that level, what the teacher's always doing is asking questions with choice and contrast. So as I'm working with Natalie, I'm saying, now we have the fish, what does your, and she says it's daytime, and I'm going to ask her more specifically, what does your daytime look like? Is it sunny or cloudy or rainy? And she starts to say sunny, and it's really bright and sunny outside. And what we've got established is for the first sentence, she's has imagery established for that. And now, remember that in concept imagery, she was to image parts, or was she to image wholes? Can you recall which this was? Right. It is to help the student process through imagery a gestalt or a whole. So the next thing I have to do is have her connect the second sentence to the first sentence. So when the archerfish spots a fly, he swims close, what do those words make you picture? This is important. Keep your same fish and add some things. So she won't just have a completely separate picture. And here's her second colored square representing that sentence. And now she's going to take all these sentences and give me a word summary. Just tell me what this is about using your images. And so she'll start to use her imagery and be able to describe verbally the whole. And that's why I called it visualizing and verbalizing. Now, once we have that established, then we can start to use that imagery for higher order thinking. So the question now stays at her with, it's still driving the sensory bus. From all of your images, what was the main idea? From your pictures, what do you think might happen next? So at all times, we are developing sensory input. Now, we're almost done. I just want to talk to you a little bit about research. I think you have the concept of what we're doing and the two types of imagery and a little bit of how we can do instruction for that. If we're looking at our decoding only students, this shows you the average standard score change after only 100 hours. And this is with an N of 4,591. And these are the changes that occur there. And the only thing that we're not getting the big change on that I would like, it's a moderate change, standard score change, is on reading rate. And at this point, we've had to make a decision that we don't want to, we can increase their reading rate, but we have to be careful not to increase their reading rate at the expense of their reading comprehension. Now let's look at these students just looking now at the Venn diagram. So looking at word attack, which would be right there. These are the students that had a mild weakness. These are students that had moderate weakness and severe weakness. So these are the students broken into these students reading at the 45th percentile, the 32nd percentile, and the 12th percentile. And honestly, we're really concerned that we make a difference for those students that have been labeled dyslexic and come in really severely impacted the way Buzz was. That's the gains, and that's the life-changing gain. Statistically significant. If we look at word recognition, we'll put that one right here. There's the standard score changes in word recognition, and look what we were able to do with severe. Look at paragraph reading accuracy. Again, looking at that inner circle, right there we're looking at, for the students that came in with very little weakness in that to the students that really had a lot of severe weakness. That's a standard score change that is extremely significant. Paragraph reading comprehension. There's the severe students and how if we can teach them to decode and read not just word attack, but word recognition skills improve, and contextual reading, those students improved in their ability to comprehend what they read. So now let's look at the comprehension only students. This one is very compelling. This is after an average of 99 hours. It's an N of 3,079. By the way, we have to date worked with 35,000 students, but that's from earlier than these that I'm showing you here are 2008 through 2014. There's comprehension. There's oral directions. There's vocabulary. You can see in looking at this that the students that were at the 25th percentile in comprehension did not have substantive weakness in vocabulary. It was all at the imagery level, more primarily at the imagery level. So let's see what happens with those students. Let me get rid of this. Magic, huh? Comprehension improved to the 47th percentile. And again, life-changing. So now what I really wanted to look at were the severe students. So if I went back and I looked just at the severe students and analyzed this is an N of 430, analyzed their testing profile, look at their word attack, their word rec, their spelling, their reading rate. Look how high these are compared to reading comprehension. And look how high their oral vocabulary is compared to following directions and reading comprehension. You can see that none of these predict this. So here's the results working with these students for an average of only 102 hours. There's their comprehension at the 8th percentile. Word opposites, that's their expressive vocabulary and their receptive vocabulary. Look at that. Absolutely an incredible change for the majority of those students. And this is obviously a mean. I'm extremely happy about that. These are the students that we worked with that came to us labeled autistic, and this is after 127 hours of instruction. Look at how we have been able to improve their comprehension. I'm going to just take you just a moment into the world of these children in schools that maybe cannot afford to come to us or are unable to come to us in a learning center. Oftentimes we do a learning center on campus for a school where we will go in and bring our staff into the school. This is an example of Center School District in Colorado, and they implemented us in 2010 to improve the achievement gap for their ELL students and their poverty students. They have the highest percent of poverty of any other school district in Colorado. 90% of their students are high poverty. The Haskin children outperformed the state. They showed a 20-point gap reduction, and the state only had a 4-point gap reduction, and this is with Lindamood-Bell. The ELL students improved from the 15th percentile to 70%, 15% proficient to 70% proficient in reading in that time. So what we do clinically can also be done with groups of children. And last but not least, that when Pat and I first had this dream to make a difference, one of the things we always talked about was how great it would be if we could change the behaviors, if we could also see if we could change what is happening in the brain. And so the most recent work that we have done has been with Georgetown University, where they saw gray matter volume changes following intervention for dyslexic children. But what's important about this slide for you to know is that we saw the significant improvement, as you would expect from what you've seen and what we've done clinically. You'd expect that we would get improvements in reading ability, but there were changes in brain structure, and those increases maintained or improved after the intervention, and that's been written up in Neuroscience. And then we also recently worked at the University of Alabama with Dr. Khanna, the impact of language remediation on brain functioning in autism. The VV intervention resulted in changing brain response patterns in children with autism. And this is what's important: specialized brain activity and functional connectivity as a result of our intervention. And we also, and I'm going to read some of this to you, we also have a paper that will be coming out in the Journal of Learning Disabilities later in the year. It's with Seeing Stars, and it's students that we worked with it was a randomized controlled study for early identification and intervention with dyslexics. Also, a couple of years ago, we did an exploratory study using new brain imaging technology called DTI, diffuser tensor imaging, to measure white matter conductivity with dyslexics. And as a result of that, Dr. Yateman, who moved on to the University of Washington, is now setting up a randomized control with us, our intervention of Seeing Stars, and the recruitment will begin this May. And I'm excited to tell you that we are in discussions with UCLA for neurological and behavioral research on comprehension and executive function and I'm very excited to tell you memory also. And last, we are hoping to make a difference for veterans and doing some intervention for veterans. There are 22 suicides a day. They think from TBI, traumatic brain injury, or PTSD, and we're hoping to get some intervention to see if we can help reduce that. So last, this is what I hope you got from this today, that there's an imagery language connection to that can be diagnosed, and instruction can be applied to help make a difference for those students. Many of the students that we see, we have been able to change their lives and make them independent because they can self-correct and because they can monitor. And the reason that they can monitor is they have the sensory input of imagery, both symbol imagery and concept imagery. Last, we believe passionately that children and adults can be taught to read and comprehend to their potential, and we hope that you will recognize the strength and weaknesses in those children and make a difference for them in their life. And I was going to read you a testimonial. I think I probably will. I think that it's sometimes very difficult for me to read some of the testimonials that we are sent, but this one is from a grandfather. He says, "I'm writing this note to tell you and the incredible Lindamood-Bell instructors that each and every one of you are absolute miracle workers. You have done what many in education would have and did think was impossible. Listen to this. You all took Sammy, my grandson who I love dearly, who was down on himself, believed he was a failure due to his inability to read at normal age and grade levels, and worse, was marginalized by his peers and teachers for the disability. He not only was unable to read beyond a third grade level versus seventh grade need, so Sammy's in seventh grade, but worse, in many ways, he was unable to comprehend and translate what little he could read at a slow pace, a situation that was devastating beyond words. In an amazing 8 weeks of dedicated instructions, and we work 4 hours a day with our students, my grandson is at grade reading level and more, and his comprehension is inspiring now to him and his family. I cannot express in words what we all feel. You know in your hearts that this accomplishment has provided a wonderful little boy with a dream, feeling good about himself, able to compete as we all must do our best and believe in his future. My God, what a more beautiful testimony to your school's work can one have. Most of us don't change one life in such a way, but you all have." Thank you very much.